what they love most about Britain, and the top answer was the countryside, even beating the Queen and fish and chips. Yet the old politicians of the old parties are, in my opinion, completely ignoring the countryside right now. We know that Labour has really always been a party of the city, never much cared for our pre and present land. So it was no surprise when, shortly before the last general election in 2010, 100 Labour MPs called for more homes to be built on the Green Belt. The Tories hit back, promising to protect the Green Belt, just like they did again last week. But I'm afraid their words are weasel words and highlight the con in Conservative. Over the past 5 years, the number of houses that have actually been built on Greenbelt land under the Conservative-led government has more than doubled. The Tories have broken their promise and shown even more hatred for the countryside than Labour. They are the ones that have been responsible for concreting over our precious green fields at a rate faster than any other government in history. To add insult to injury, the Tories did this despite promising local people more say over what happens in their area back in their last manifesto. Localism, they called it. In reality, they introduced what was effectively a developer's charter called the National Planning Policy Framework, which argued against conservation and for a presumption in favour of development. In essence, this has given developers a green light to build just about anywhere, and to hell with what the locals think. Neither does it matter whether there are enough local school places, enough health services, any decent public transport or road networks, what pressure there might be on local water or power supplies. The rush to solve the housing crisis takes priority over everything, and especially the countryside. You couldn't trust the Tories with the countryside in 2010, and whatever they might say at their manifesto launch today, you can't trust them with the countryside now. And I think voters need to consider this very carefully, particularly if they live in rural areas. Once the countryside's gone, it's gone. You can't get our green fields back once they've been lost. And this isn't just about beauty, it's about our food security too. Only 1.3% of our British workforce now works in agriculture, and we are importing 40% of our food, which is far too much. We must reverse this trend if we're to avoid being exposed to volatile global food and animal feed markets, which push up prices dramatically for producers and, of course, then for consumers too. 3 years ago, the Conservative Planning Minister, Nick Bowles, warned that 2 million acres of green fields need to be sacrificed for housing. To put that into context, that's the equivalent of concreting over half of Wales, or the entire county of Devon, together with an area 7 times the size of Windsor Great Park. But yes, we're desperate for housing. This is the cry that goes up, isn't it? Why? Demographic changes, more of us living alone, our growing population. But funny, there's very rarely, if ever, any mention of the I word, immigration. No mention of the fact that over 600,000 people came to live in Britain last year, over 500,000 the year before that, and almost 500,000 too before that, and back we go. 7 million more people arriving under Blair and Brown, and 2 million more under Cameron. It's ironic, I think, to think that some of those migrants may very well have been drawn to Britain because our land is so green and pleasant. Net immigration is now at an all-time high. If we want to have any countryside left for ourselves and for others to enjoy, we have to stop uncontrolled immigration and relieve the pressure on demand for housing, schools, healthcare services, transport, policing and the benefits system. It's only UKIP that has the holistic answer to this, one that eases the pressure of immigration and does the right thing by our countryside, and that's our Australian-style points-based system. UKIP is the party that will protect the Green Belt. We feel very passionately about this. We see the sense in shoring up our food security and keeping our most loved British icon, the countryside, for future generations. We'll prioritise bringing Britain's 300,000-odd empty homes back into use and incentivise developers to build 1 million homes on brownfield sites by 2025, long before we even begin to consider allowing the destruction of our precious greenbelt. And even then, we'll be talking about small developments of 6 to 12 houses on the edges of villages, not outrageous mass developments like the 360 houses planned for Bicton, the village where I went to school near Shrewsbury in Shropshire, and which I hope to attend a meeting about tonight. The locals are furious, and quite rightly so. UKIP will also give local people the final say on major developments through a binding referendum. If 5% of the electors in their area say they don't want a large development, they won't get it. And this, I'd like to say to Mr Cameron, to Mr Pickles, this is real localism. I'd just like to finish by saying I really do believe, as a former country girl myself and as someone who still has a house and lives in Shrewsbury in Shropshire, that both Labour and Tories abandoned it long ago. But today, UKIP really is the only party of the countryside. Thank you.
Right, we're open to questions.
Suzanne and Patrick, Joe Coburn at the BBC. Do you agree with Nigel Farage when he certainly hinted that in areas where UKIP has no hope of winning the seat, that they should vote Tory?
No, he didn't either say or hint that. He simply recognised that in some seats, some voters may indulge in tactical voting. Actually, the seats he has in mind are places like Great Grimsby, Dudley North, Hayward and Middleton, where if you're a previously Tory-inclined voter, you absolutely know that if you vote Tory, you'll be helping Labour get into power, whereas if you vote UKIP, UKIP can win the seat and keep Labour out. But as leader of UKIP and as the leadership team for UKIP, the message is 100%. We support every UKIP candidate. We're maximising the votes for every UKIP candidate in the country, and we're getting back fantastic reports about the reception people are getting, even in some of the seats that weren't our top targets, places like Mid-Norfolk or Northamptonshire South. We're right in the running, right in the mix.
But there's an acceptance you need tactical voting in order to shore up your support.
No, I think, you know, if you were a Tory-inclined voter, say in Great Grimsby or Dudley North, where, you know, your candidate's just self-combusted, and there is a sort of 25% residual Tory vote, but the polls are showing that it's a knife-edge battle between UKIP and Labour. You've got a decision to make. You know, you're quite entitled to stick to your previous choice, but we think that very many supporters, residual supporters, former supporters of the other so-called main parties prefer UKIP than their direct rival, if you're talking about Labour and the Tories, because their rivalry is so long established.
Hello, John Stevens from the Daily Mail. Where's your environment and housing spokesman today, and why is he not giving this speech? And Suzanne, you talk about your house in Shrewsbury. How many houses do you have, and do you think second homes are a problem?
I have two and a third homes. I have a flat in London, I have a flat in Shrewsbury, and I have a share in a house that myself and my family bought for my daughter, who's at university. I was deeply concerned about the huge amount of debt that she was racking up as a student. And so I sold my one house in London and bought the others. It's something I feel very passionately about, student debt. My daughter wanted to do a long degree course. The amount of rent she was paying for pretty appalling accommodation, frankly, was shocking. So that's why I sold up and I think did the decent thing by my daughter, and I hope nobody will criticise me for that. And
if I can answer your other question, Andrew Sharalambos, our excellent housing spokesman, I know where he is because I spoke to him this morning. He is in Wisbeach in northeast Cambridgeshire, where he's standing, and where UKIP also has the Conservatives on the run, with uncontrolled immigration being an absolutely massive issue in those Fenland towns. So he is campaigning there today. And this wasn't, I should say, a big speech. This is a presentation to raise an issue that we think is very important in the campaign.
He's already made his big housing speech, actually. I don't know if you were there, but he's certainly done that.
Ben Glaze, Daily Mirror. So just to go back to John's question, do you think second home ownership is an issue then?
Well, I don't think. I mean, I think there are much bigger issues. You know, my homes are both very modest and quite small, really. I think immigration, as I've said today, is the bigger issue. And if you look at the huge amounts of people coming into the country, then that is surely a priority for any government, but the others are simply refusing to look at it. And there's no doubt that that is the biggest demographic pressure that we have, and it's got to be sorted. And you look at the Labour Party manifesto yesterday, what a joke. We will control immigration. A single line. They're not planning to do anything more that the Tories haven't done over the past 5 years and utterly failed it. And I can't imagine that the Conservatives will bring forward any more plans today.
Yeah. Clearly, any party that wants to solve the housing crisis for the British people has to be able to say they will sharply reduce immigration, and only one party can say that, and that's UKIP.
How many homes should Brits be allowed to own then?
Well, it depends what they use them for, doesn't it? I mean, I think one of the things I do feel quite strongly about is buy-to-let. There are landlords who own, huge amounts of properties, and I think there might well be a question about that. But that's not the main issue here.
I mean, as Suzanne says, I don't think we're not the sort of party that's going to put limits on property ownership by the British people in their own country. But we do have some strong positions we take that, with housing being a finite resource and a resource that's in great shortage, we say, for instance, we would not allow non-British nationals in social housing to have the right to buy. We would not allow non-British nationals to take advantage of Help to Buy schemes with taxpayer incentives, and equally today on the Housing Association policy that the Tories are going to be announcing, we in general welcome anything that helps people achieve their ambitions and aspirations to be a homeowner, but we don't think foreign nationals, again, should be given discounts to acquire property in this country when property is in such short supply.
Richard Wheeler, Press Association. Twofold really. First, you sort of mentioned that you have sort of a modest number of houses, you don't think they're too big and that sort of stuff. What does your research show in terms of people that do come over and immigrants, how many houses they actually have? Have you sort of researched into this? And secondly, on the referendum proposal, who's actually paying for that? Is that falling on the developers or councils to organise? What sort of more thoughts have you got on that?
On the referendum, that will be funded. And in fact, it's not just local referendum that we're talking to. I think Douglas Carswell announced yesterday, every 2 years we will have a national referendum too on the issue that is of most importance to the British people. And that is, we have costed that, and that will be part of our manifesto plan costings. And I think it's great, that not only can people have a final say on what happens in their local area, but they will also nationally be able to directly influence what goes into the Queen's speech. Sorry, I can't remember what your first question was.
What research have you done in terms of immigrants that come over and actually buy houses and housing numbers that they own taken away from Britain?
There's a huge variation of scale there, isn't there? You have some very wealthy people coming into the country who are buying up houses and then just hardly ever using them and leaving them empty for most of the year, which is a great shame. And on the other hand, you have migrants coming in who are living in incredibly poor, cramped conditions, and effectively driving up rents for locals as well, because even if you're on a very low wage, if you're crammed into a house with 10 or however many of you there are, that's a very difficult issue then. It pushes up prices for everybody else too. And at the same time, you've got people living in rather squalid conditions, which is equally unfortunate. It's a massive problem. There's no simple answer to this, I don't think.
I think actually that there was quite a good expose in John's paper at the beginning of the year from Westminster Council about them thinking the right to buy was being abused potentially by foreign nationals who were coming in and being on housing benefit and then suddenly having the money to make a right to buy application. And I think Westminster, obviously a Tory-controlled authority, the Daily Mail did some good work exposing worries there that foreign nationals were exploiting right to buy, which is another reason why we say we would not allow foreign nationals to do that. And obviously, in order to put British people first across these housing policies, you would need to be outside the European Union, because EU law obliges national governments to treat every EU citizen in every respect as they would their own.
I think in Westminster alone, 31% of former council houses are now owned by buy-to-let landlords. I think there's an issue there.
How does it just on the countryside issue as well? I mean, how does sort of limiting development in certain areas. I mean, what's the transition period we've got here? Because the numbers for people coming into the country aren't suddenly going to stop. You know, if your policies came in, there's still going to be people coming in and housing demand.
Well,
rising.
actually, I don't know that that's the case. I mean, if we were to have a European Union referendum, if the public were to vote that we would leave the European Union, then our policies, you know, we would be able to say, introduce our Australian point star system, and then we could stop the flow very quickly. I mean, we've said that we'll have a 5-year moratorium on immigration for unskilled workers. That will immediately cut numbers by 150,000 a year. And then we'll have the skilled workers coming in will be decided on that points-based system. I think it could actually make a very significant difference in a very short space of time.
You say that you've got a problem with empty properties. What would you do with all of those empty properties currently owned by what you call wealthy migrants? A lot of them probably would meet the criteria of your points-based system. And what would you do with those migrants living in existing HMOs? Have you got any retrospective plans? Can I also just ask what your estimate is for the amount of brownfield land that is currently available in acres?
Our research suggests that there are potentially, I'm not quite sure about the number in acres, and one of the things that we need to do is actually discover exactly how much brownfield land we've got. So one of our policies that we would ask for a national register to be created of brownfield sites. We estimate, not our estimates actually, there are other organisations that have estimated you could build up to 2.5 million properties on brownfield sites. That's obviously a little bit beyond our capabilities, I think, in the next 5 years. As I said, we'll be looking to put 1 million homes on brownfield sites by 2025, and we'll be rolling out a programme of grants and incentives to developers to do that, including removing stamp duty from first sale of new properties on brownfield sites and offering grants of £10,000 to developers per unit where there is need to clean up the land on brownfield sites, which has traditionally been something that has put developers off. Obviously, a lot of brownfield sites are also in areas of existing infrastructure, so you don't have the other problems that I talked about not having access to schools, to transport links and so on and so forth. So brownfield is definitely much a priority. In terms of what we can do about empty properties, I think that the figure of 300,000 is really those that are in a fairly run-down state, and those are the ones that we'll be targeting, not wealthy people who can pay their own way.
What with CPOs? Would you want local authorities would CPO the empty properties? What's the mechanism you'd use?
Yes, certainly that would be something that we would give to local authorities to be able to do that when houses have been deliberately left to run down and go to rack and ruin over a number of years. Houses of multiple occupation you also mentioned, that's a significant problem. I think it's a great shame that again, this is the Tory government removed the need to apply for planning permission to transform your property into a HMO and instead just made it a permitted development right. I think that's something that should be looked at. I think a lot of people are extremely concerned about the way in which houses of multiple occupation are not looked after terribly well and therefore cause problems in a locality. And I certainly know a lot of my former Conservative councillors were particularly upset that it was their government that actually brought in that rather unfortunate rule change.
Right, thank you very much, everybody. Have a good day on the campaign trail. Oh, Joe, you've got one more question?
One more question.
Come on, Joe. You're in the Andrew Neil.
Oh,
You're in the Andrew Neil ceremonial grumpy chair. So.
Thank you for saving it for me. How far do you think the Tory plan to allow housing association tenants to buy their own properties will help in his bid to UKIP voters to come home to the Conservatives?
Well, I don't think it will, and the devil will be in the detail of this policy. I believe there's already something called right to acquire for housing association tenants. It'll be interesting to see how significant any proposed extension or facilitating of the ownership route really is in this policy. You know, some people may fear there might be an element of gimmick in it. I think the vast majority of people who intend to vote UKIP, you know, have had it with David Cameron's brand of conservatism, even if they were ever Conservative voters in the past, and an increasingly large proportion of our vote have never been attracted by the Tory message. So I think they see a man they can't really trust. You know, he says things on inheritance tax. He hasn't raised the threshold by a single penny for 5 years, and I think it was the 2013 budget small print revealed that they intend to keep the same rate of inheritance tax, the same threshold all the way to 2018. You know, cast iron promise of a referendum on the Lisbon Treaty, that got dropped as well. cast iron promise to bring net immigration down to the tens of thousands. It's running at nearly 300,000. I think, you know, millions and millions of people have just had it with David Cameron as a man who doesn't keep his promises. Thank you.